Ready? No. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. I can hear my voice. So. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. And thank you for coming to attend this meeting about unleashing growth and strengthening resilience in the Caribbean. I have to say this is perhaps one of the most comprehensive reviews and analysis of a region in the Americas that has been published in the past at least 3 years that takes quite a deep look into certain patterns relating to economic growth in Latin America and the Caribbean, in this case, in the Caribbean. So we're very pleased to have a discussion of the book findings and some of the issues raised along those lines. For those who haven't read the book, it's quite a nice piece of work. It has a lot of material that basically attempts to answer to one single question, and that is what explains the slow economic growth that Caribbean economies have experienced basically since the 2000 period, more or less. And as the authors stress, there is not a single answer that can explain that slowing growth. However, there are some issues that they try to hint into, for example, patterns that occur within those economies oriented to tourism in the Caribbean, or issues related to migration and remittances, as well as to difficulties in doing business in the Caribbean. There are also other issues relating to development finance, and particularly financial access for financial institutions whose accounts are closed, that have been closing particularly over the past 10 years. So it's really quite a rich material, and we're pleased to have today two of the authors that participated in the production of the study, and a guest speaker that will comment on the discussion of the findings. First, we have Joyce Wong, who will be giving an overview of the patterns in the Caribbean economies, and second, Sebastián Acevedo will be talking in some other detail on some of the issues relating to economic growth. And Dan Erickson will comment on these few issues. Definitely, it's a thought-provoking material. Lots of ideas, lots of questions to raise, and of course, from an academic point of view, there is quite a food for thought on some of the issues that are raised in the book. One of the particulars of the Caribbean economies is that some of this growth is connected to the fact that these are predominantly economies that work along the lines of low labor-intensive economic activities, tourism, a huge or significantly large informal economy, working in the export process, the free trade zones with low-skilled labor. And so you do have some of the problems relating to human capital and its endowment. So economic growth may be associated to some of these factors. So with that, I turn it to Joyce. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Manuel, for the fantastic introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So what I'm going to do is just to begin with a quick overview of the book. As Manuel pointed out, there's a lot of themes that run through it. We talk about a lot of these issues. So I just want to touch upon them a little bit just to set up the conversation. And then I'm going to zoom in a little bit on the topic of immigrants and remittances for the Caribbean. And then I will pass it to Sebastian to then discuss natural disasters. So just to give a sense of where we are in the Caribbean now. The region has made significant strides. So from the point of view of GDP per capita, from the point of view of issues like voice and accountability, the region does exceptionally well. Even in terms of health outcomes like infant mortality rates and life expectancy, the region is very much in the top percentiles of the EMDE average, the emerging markets. And of course, even in female labor force participation, the region also is doing extremely well. It's above the median for the emerging markets. So it has come very far, but since 2000s, GDP growth has started to lag. And this is especially clear for the tourism-based economies. So if you focus on the blue lines in the first two charts, you will see that both in terms of real GDP and GDP per capita, they have basically slowed down, and in some instances, in the case of GDP per capita, it has actually started to turn downwards. All of this has translated to a slowing convergence first, and then actually a slightly backwards turn, as you can see in the last chart. So what has happened to the region? In a sense, the region has been facing shocks like natural disasters, which in a sense have become so regular that they are almost structural issues at this point in the region. There's been lots of preferential trade agreements, especially with the European Union. And there's, of course, the structural issues, the high levels of violent crime, the brain drain, which has been ongoing, the high cost of doing business. And all of these things, plus the fact that there's high levels of debt and weak fiscal positions, it means that buffers are not there to cushion against the shocks and to put in place reforms that will structurally change issues like crime or brain drain or high cost of doing business. Combined with issues like high levels of non-performing loans and difficult bank credit access, these are all reducing the level of buffers and reforms that can be put in place. So let me just touch upon the fiscal situation. This probably is not new to the majority of you who have worked on the Caribbean. The levels of government debt right now are the highest in the last half century, and it's 30 percentage points above emerging markets average. You can see this in the dark blue line on the leftmost chart. And a lot of this debt is foreign debt. So you can see the red parts in the center charts, which means that for a lot of these countries, the adjustment level, so how much they have to adjust their fiscal position in order to attain debt sustainability, where we have countries that reach 10, 12 percentage points of GDP in adjustment. So that's what's shown in the last chart. So there's basically very little space on the fiscal side. And then, of course, the structural issues that I mentioned before. The high cost of doing business, which are impeding growth. You can see it in the scatter plot that the majority of the Caribbean countries, with the exception of Jamaica, they're lying on the higher portion of the high cost of doing business. And then the heat map is attempting to give you a very quick view of the biggest constraints. So let me just point out on the tourism side, what we have is natural disasters and the high government debt. That's where you see the big red spots. On the commodity economies, it's the lack of diversification, the big size of the government. But one issue that comes across both of them is the issue of immigration and the brain drain, which we'll touch upon very soon. So just to touch on other issues which were not in that heat map that the book also covers, energy matrix in the region remains very reliant on oil. So on the leftmost chart, we just have a comparison between the energy matrix mix of the world, generation mix of the world, versus the Caribbean, and you can see that over 80% of the Caribbean energy mix is based on oil. Jamaica has made a lot of efforts on making this change, and it's become very much a leading example of this. Jamaica has started converting its energy plants to LNG, and the second column in 2016 shows the progress that was made by the conversion of one energy plant. And the expectation is that there's going to be a new LNG plant coming in 2019. And by then, the government is also aiming for 20 to 30% in renewables. So this is very ambitious, and it looks like it's on track for that switch, going from about 94% dependent on heavy fuel oils to about 40% dependent on heavy fuel oils. And then, of course, crime. Those of you who are following the news, especially on Jamaica, you have seen that murders have completely gone out of control and just now in 2018. And it's not just Jamaica, as you can see from the chart. There's a lot of the Caribbean countries rates against GDP per capita. all of the crime imposes significant costs. There's the cost of just the government, running the police, running the prisons. There is private sector costs, just of hiring security as opposed to investing in other more productive uses for the capital. And then, of course, there's the social costs. The incarceration, the fact that people no longer are working, and the fact that victims, for example, may have lost productivity. So all of this together, costs could be 5 to 6 percentage points of GDP. And this is based on detailed IDB work that was actually presented here a few months back. We joined for a discussion, so please do take a look. They have a very, very detailed study on Caribbean crime. Last, just to summarize everything, this is based on just a regression work on asking what are the biggest hindrances to growth in the region. And you see that greater ease of doing business and lower disaster damage are the two things that could yield significant gains for many of these countries. They're of course different, so just pointing out, I work on Jamaica, I notice immediately that those two factors I just mentioned are not as big for Jamaica. For Jamaica, for example, we have the issue of crime, we have the issue of debt. And of course, we also have the need for greater human capital, which directly also links with the problem of brain drain. So just to give you a quick snapshot of the very different and yet very similar issues plaguing the region. So let me go a little deeper now into the issue of immigration and remittances. This is work that we did in-house, but a lot of the work is based on World Bank data, and they have this fantastic remittances database that I'm sure many of you know about. So they have also done a lot of the work on this issue. So for the Caribbean, outward migration has been a big phenomenon. These are small countries. So in terms of population lost, we're talking about 1/5 of the Caribbean population is now outside of the region. So this is 20% compared to, for example, only 10% in the CIS countries, which is the second highest group. Of course, for the smaller Caribbean countries, the population loss is much, much bigger. These are small countries. In the case of Dominica, you have as many people outside Dominica than in, so it's exactly the same size. But even for countries like Jamaica, they do have nearly 40% of the population outside of Jamaica. This has also generated good outcomes. So remittances are sizable. In the case of Haiti and Jamaica, this is way above 15% of GDP. But even for most of the region, this is nearing at least 5% of GDP for the majority of the countries. In general, only when compared to Central America, our remittances flow is smaller. So Central America receives the most, and it has increased a lot. But Caribbean has also increased and has remained relatively high throughout the 2000s. But what is the difference for Caribbean immigrants? And this is the reason why brain drain is such an issue for the region. While Mexico and Central America, they're immigrants, and this is immigrants in the US for which we were able to get microdata. Their Mexican and Central American immigrants tend to be lower educated. So for instance, 62% of Mexican immigrants in the US had less than high school. For the Caribbean, the same number is only 18%. At the same time, we have something like 37% of Caribbean immigrants have more than high school, so college and above, compared to only about 14% for Mexico. So it's a very different type of immigrant, the Caribbean. And as a result, of course, this is also shown in the wages that these immigrants receive in the US. So we have an average of about $17 to $19 an hour, compared to something like $9 to $12 an hour for Mexican immigrants. And they also have different remitting behaviors. So given the sizable stocks and given the high wages of Caribbean immigrants, one would think that perhaps remittances would even be higher. So what do we see for remitters? Caribbean immigrants, of course, because they earn more, you see more of remitting households in the upper ends of the income distribution. So at about the group that earns between $75,000 to $100,000 a year, there's a lot of remitters for the Caribbean in that group. But how much they remit as proportion of their income is much smaller. It's about 4% of their total income, compared to something like 40 or 30% of their income for Central American households. So, on balance, what is the effect of immigration and remittances for the Caribbean? Because the region has lost a lot of highly educated workforce, on balance, the joint effect of both remittances and immigration is negative. We are unfortunately not able to disentangle the effect, so ask the question, what is alone the effect of remittances versus alone the effect of immigration? Because it's impossible to have remittances without immigration, so we cannot ask that question. But jointly, what it means is that any positive effect that remittances may have on growth is undone by the negative effect of the loss in human capital, especially for the Caribbean. But it's not all bad. Remittances do play a role against shocks. And we see that, for example, around natural disasters, in the years of natural disasters, we see that remittances for the Caribbean jump up by about 1 percentage point of GDP to then revert the year after to their natural levels. So they do play a role against shocks. In the chapter itself, we discuss issues like self-insurance at the micro level. So receiving remittances can help somebody in the country self-insure against, for example, unemployment, self-insure against difficult situations with health. So if you are interested in this topic, there's definitely more in the chapter. With the topic of natural disasters, I now segue to Sebastian, who's going to tell us a little bit more about it.
Thank you. I'm going to talk to you about the impact of natural disasters, which is one of the big drags on growth for the Caribbean. The problem for the region is that they're one of the most vulnerable regions in the world, along with small states. They have higher frequency of events per land area. They have larger damages as a share of their GDP, and their growth prospects are hurt the most after a natural disaster compared to the rest of the world. And this results in significant human and economic costs for the region. If you look at the total number of disasters, the absolute number of disasters, you have that large countries with large land masses like the US and China have the most natural disasters in the world on a given year. The US and China have about 25 natural disasters. But that's because the US and China are roughly 12,000 times larger than the median Caribbean country. So the Caribbean receives one disaster every 2 years. But once you account for the size of the countries, you have that the 30 top places, if you were to rank all the countries in the world between the highest number of disasters per kilometer square to the lowest, you would have that the top 30 places are all small islands. And most of them are Caribbean countries. So here you can see, the frequency of disasters per kilometer square compared to the average of the world. And here we have all the Caribbean islands. And you can see that most of the region is above the world average. And this is a problem for them. So that's the frequency of events. But we also see that damages, the economic costs that these disasters cause, are larger for the region. On average, the world suffers 0.4% of GDP in damages every year since 1990. But for the Caribbean, that's 6 times larger. 2.4% of GDP gets destroyed every single year on average in the Caribbean. That's a lot of capital destruction. These are housing, buildings, roads, and other critical infrastructure that needs to be repaired after a natural disaster takes place. And part of the reason why natural disasters are much larger for the region than for the rest of the world is that usually when a disaster strikes a small country, for example, here we have the example of Dominica being hit by Hurricane Maria last year, it affects the whole country. When a natural disaster strikes a large country like the US, only a couple of states get hurt at most, while the rest of the country is unscattered. So to put things in perspective, the largest natural disaster in the history of the US, the costliest natural disaster in the history of the US, caused about 125 billion in damages, and that was Hurricane Katrina. But that was only about 1% of GDP. In the other hand, we have for Grenada, they suffer about 1 billion in damages after Hurricane Ivan struck the island. But that accounted for almost 150% of their economy. So that strikes a very different picture for when a disaster hits a large country versus a smaller one. But it doesn't stop there. We've seen that damages are underreported. Like roughly 40% of the disasters caused by hurricanes in the Caribbean do not have reported damages. But that doesn't mean that there were no damages at all. It means that there was no assessment of those damages after the event. So if we look at the numbers for hurricanes in the Caribbean, reported damages amount to 1.6% of GDP every year since 1950. But if we include all the missing damages, that 40% that is not reported, damages could be as high as 2.5% of GDP a year. But there's even evidence that natural disasters themselves could be underreported, especially in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, because back then reporting wasn't as good. So if we were to estimate the missing disasters that could have happened in the past, given the hurricane tracks, we see that damages could be as high as 5.7% of GDP a year. And these are very large numbers that these countries have to deal with on a regular basis. So we've talked about the frequency of events and the damages that they cause, but they also mean and translate into a larger drop in output after a disaster strikes. Here we have the cumulative effect on real GDP per capita 7 years after a hurricane strikes. And for the average country in the world, they lose about 1% of GDP per capita. But that's 4 times larger for the Caribbean region. And that's because the Caribbean, as I explained before, small states that get hit by larger events and are affecting more of their economies. So these are very persistent and negative effects. And part of that is through the impact on tourism. Here we see the effect of a natural disaster on tourism on a monthly basis. So the month that a natural disaster strikes, we see that tourism arrivals drop by something 20 to 40%, depending on the country. And cumulatively, over a year, they could lose as much as 90% of the tourist arrivals that they would usually have. And that they only start to recover and come back to normal 1 year after the event. And this is for usually for large disasters. In countries where they're usually not so dramatic events, the effect tends to be more muted. But for countries that suffer big disasters, the impact is larger, like we've seen here. So it's essential for countries in the Caribbean to invest in prevention and prepare and build resilience. But as Joyce talked, there's little fiscal buffers in the region to do so. But the World Bank has shown in this chart, for example, that we summarize here, that the investment in prevention for different types of disasters more than pays for itself. The red line shows you the break-even point, and the bar shows you how much is the return on investments to prevent different types of disasters. And it's clear that the investments pay off. The question is how to get them to be able to do these investments. So part of what we're doing with the Caribbean is trying to get countries to recognize in their fiscal frameworks and in their regulations the risk of these disasters. They need to incorporate how much is lost on an average year by disasters. They need to better prepare their infrastructure. They need to do more in terms of building codes and zoning laws to protect people and infrastructure. And we're helping countries by doing climate change assessments in pilot countries and helping them incorporate this information so that they can be better prepared in the future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here today. I'm glad the Inter-American Dialogue is continuing the tradition of having their Caribbean meetings in Washington in January. But I'm hopeful that the IMF will fund a road tour through the Caribbean in February. I'm available. But let me just say at the outset, I think as everyone has already seen, that this study is a real contribution to the literature on the Caribbean. And I really congratulate the authors and their many colleagues who are not with us today for really drilling down very specifically on some of the challenges that the Caribbean is facing. My friend Richard Bernal often says the Caribbean is too democratic and not poor enough, by which it means that it performs well on governance indicators, yet tends not to be a recipient of a great amount of foreign assistance, favorable trade arrangements, and so forth. And that is part of the challenge that's left many of the islands in the region facing this kind of middle-income trap, where they're doing relatively well, but as it has been stated, they're underperforming both emerging markets as well as other small states. And the question is, why is this happening, and what can be done about it? I think my colleagues from the fund have done a great job of really looking at some specific instances in terms of both a sectoral analysis and country-by-country analysis of the challenges that the Caribbean is facing. I see many Caribbean experts here in the room, and so many of you are familiar with these challenges, but they include, as has been stated, very high levels of government debt, emigration of skilled people, vulnerability to natural disasters. One Caribbean author, Junot Diaz from the DR, has said that it's not possible to be from the Caribbean without having some familiarity with the apocalypse. And as has been stated by Sebastian, it may not be the apocalypse, but certainly severe natural disasters strike this region on a regular basis. You also have, in some countries, high rates of violent crime, business environments that could be more favorable, and relatively limited trade integration. And so a lot of these challenges are really deeply rooted. They can't be addressed easily, but I think they can be addressed over time. And of course, so much of this does come back to the tourism sector, which is driving a lot of the Caribbean economies, and how do you compete in this sector as it becomes more competitive, and as Caribbean tourist offerings are being challenged by other parts of the world or other parts of Latin America as well. In general, and I've spent a fair amount of time in the Caribbean, it seems like the Caribbean economies tend to run off some mix of a relatively limited number of factors. Those include tourism, financial services, perhaps some light mining, some manufacturing, some agriculture, and certainly remittances. And what we've seen is that all of these can be, or many of them are very vulnerable to natural disasters and other shocks. And in particular, the tourist industry, I think, is one that could be grown and diversified, but also perhaps could be expanded to look at other service sectors as well. Some countries have done well by looking at how to expand their education services, services in healthcare, particularly for aging North American and European markets. Some tech call centers and things of this like, which could both attract and keep talented human capital, as well as really provide a more diversified set of economic opportunities for those on the islands. The other question of the Caribbean too is how much can these Caribbean countries think about developing themselves, not just nationally, but as transnational economies. At the end of the day, they're relatively limited in terms of size and scope, but they have, in some cases, quite large and wealthy diaspora populations that can continue to invest. There are some countries that have been much more forward-leaning in terms of granting dual citizenship and having their citizens allowed to have citizen rights in their countries, but also be dual nationals in other countries. And Manuel Orozco, who's chairing the panel, is an expert on this issue of the transnational economies and nostalgic trade and remittances. But that's one way that the Caribbean could perhaps overcome some of the challenges that it faces today. I was also intrigued in the study that there was a very nice chapter on Cuba and the opening to Cuba, and whether that will really challenge or drain the tourist sectors in some of these other countries. I would almost call the chapter kind of an econometric meditation. It had lots of charts and graphs and pointed us in a certain a certain direction. But what it indicates is that the relationship between Cuba and the Caribbean countries does not need to be zero-sum when it comes to tourism. And in fact, there's a way that these islands can band together to strengthen the tourist capacity throughout and perhaps bring in more visitors. You could potentially add to that the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and other countries as well. And so that may be one area where the countries from the region may actually want to look more closely at how they can collaborate. And I think some of that work is taking place already. I was also very pleased you noted the work on Jamaica and the energy sector. That was one thing that one of my last tasks in government was to help Vice President Joe Biden organize the Central American Caribbean Energy Summit, which took place in May of 2016. And he was extremely focused on this issue of how to make the Caribbean energy sectors more diversified and provide them with more opportunities to use wind, solar, geothermal, as well as, in some cases, open up to LNG. And I think that when you look at what the U.S. has done previously in terms of investments from OPIC in the renewable sector in many of these countries, clean energy finance, and encouraging energy integration, all of this was very important work that could be continued. There was one country that I did not see particularly mentioned in the energy chapter, which was Venezuela. And I think that's perhaps another, maybe a sequel or an epilogue, but certainly looking at the role of Venezuela in the Caribbean energy matrix has been extremely important over the last decade and will continue to be so moving forward. And I also think maybe staying on this theme of what I know you just finished this book, but there might be one more book in the works, but really looking more at how the Caribbean is engaging with larger economic partners generally, certainly including the United States, but the European Union, Canada. I would add to that list China, which has become very engaged in the Caribbean over the last several years, and has created a lot of attention and enthusiasm, and in some countries hope that China can kind of step in as an economic partner, and where some of the traditional Western partners are perhaps slightly less engaged. And so that's another area worth looking at. I'd also note that here in the United States last year, Congress passed HR 4939 to mandate the U.S. government to come up with a strategy engaging with the Caribbean. The State Department issued the first version of this strategy in 2017. I note that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is headed to Latin America on a 5-country visit next week, or I guess the end of this week, and his last stop will be Jamaica. And so that's a hopeful sign, too, that the U.S. will start engaging more directly in the Caribbean. So just to conclude, I would say congratulations. It was a great book. It was a good read. I think this is a book that's built to last. I think people who focus on these issues will be referring to this work for some time to come. And I look forward to your next endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Definitely, I'm assuming you already read it, so you're prepared to ask your very intelligent questions or comments. So we're going to start having 3 questions from the audience, and then we'll go on that basis. I'll save my comments for later, but one interesting piece of information or data is that on a global scale, islands happen to be the countries with the highest immigration rates in the world, and landlocked countries happen to be the ones with the lowest immigration rates in the world. And it's just fascinating to wonder why that happens. Also, another interesting thought, factoid is that their countries, islands are typically the ones that are less likely to have civil rebellion, civil wars, etc. Most countries actually happen to have it in places where they can connect and go across borders. But especially in the Caribbean, you have, given the fact that Latin America in general has this history of fighting, the Caribbean has a smaller propensity for it. So let's open the floor. Just a quiz.
Yes, good morning. My name is Paul Spencer. Originally hail from the Pure Island nation of Antigua and Barbuda, and I'm associated with the OAS. I haven't read the book, but just based on what you've said, you've offered a number of options for unleashing the growth and resilience. So my question to you, and let's say I'm a policymaker, what one or two issues would be most significant to unleash such growth, or are you proposing that they all must be taken as a combination of factors?
Thank you. Anybody else over there?
Hi, Helen Santiago Fink. I'm a climate urbanist and a researcher with Urban Breezes Research Collaborative. I'm curious, in your very nice graphs and trajectories, do you see an increase in terms of both hardening their infrastructure or just increasing the disaster risk prevention mechanisms or measures, given that every 2 years on average they withstand the disaster? So have you seen that trajectory in terms of increasing their climate resiliency over time?
Hi, good morning. My name is Christopher Chung. I'm with the World Bank. I wanted to ask about that slide that you put up about the unaccounted for damages that happen as a result of disasters, because I'm assuming that a lot of those damages are actually incurred within the housing sector. We encounter similar challenges where a lot of times after a disaster strikes, we're unable to account for the damages and losses that are incurred in the housing sector, but we assume that a lot of times most of the damages are incurred within that. So I'm just curious to hear, one, do you consider the housing sector at all in the analysis that you do, but also to what extent do you think that investing in the resilience of the housing sector will be a critical element in being able to promote poverty reduction efforts within the region?
My name is Roland Roebuck. I'm from Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, two places that were not mentioned today, and I'm sort of not that upset that it's not mentioned. So the tradition of excluding those U.S. former colonies continues throughout the day. My question is this: what is the responsibility of former colonial powers with respect to providing technical assistance to these islands? And number two, with respect to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, how the presidential view of this region, sort of, shithole regions, affect the development of those islands, meaning presidential immigration policy towards the development of islands in the Caribbean, primarily the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico.
Thank you. We'll take 4 questions and then we'll go to another round. Thank you.
Let me begin by taking the first question on the factors. So the slide is no longer up there, so I'm just going to show it by hand. This is one of the ways. So what we've done, this is just simple econometrics. We've basically thrown the kitchen sink and asked what are the factors that derive the most growth. But this is not the full picture, of course. To say that, of course, all you have to do is lower the disaster damage or ease the cost of doing business doesn't quite give the full issue. For example, I'm going to talk more about Jamaica because it's a case I know the best. Jamaica, you see that, for example, crime is the key issue. But at the same time, debt is also a key issue. So you asked, should they just focus or should it be a combination? In the Jamaica's case, those two are interlinked. The fact that there's high debt means that there's very little fiscal space to address the issues of crime. So then you have to start bringing down your debt at the same time that you channel resources towards crime. In the Jamaica case, we also discuss issues, so it's not just the debt, it's also, for example, issues like public sector transformation. Also bring down the government, the size of the government, the public sector wage bill, to direct more resources towards crime. So in a nutshell, for all these countries, I'm sure there's going to be similar stories that it's not just, oh yeah, let's just lower the damage of natural disasters, let's build fantastic infrastructure. It's really how can we leverage several different issues and target the priority one. So at the same time we target, but then we have to move other areas in order to target.
Okay. So regarding the question about the investment in climate resilience over time, it's difficult to say because there's no good data sets that collect that type of information of the investments and whether they were targeting specific climate risks. But we have seen that, especially in countries that get hit by large disasters, they tend to start preparing better for the future. The problem is, and I'm thinking, for example, in concrete, in the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I used to work there for more than 4 years. And after they got hit by 2 consecutive natural disasters, they started to build a plan for 10-year, planning on a horizon of 10 years, building in their planning, their infrastructure, their development, their investments also in human capital to account for these disasters. But it's not easy for them to do it, especially when they get so frequently hit. Especially if you have very few years between events, you're almost never catching up to the destruction that happened. And that's one of the big problems that they face. Now, regarding the question about the housing sector, the data that we use is from the International Disaster Database. And unfortunately, in there is not possible to disentangle exactly which sectors we've seen the damages in. But from experience in the region with some areas where they have had disasters, yes, a large portion of the damages are to the housing infrastructure, roofs that get blown, or flooding that happens in the storm event. So a large portion of the disasters are there. And yes, investment in housing would be critical. But it's not just investment in the housing, but it's also zoning laws that are taking into account the new events that are happening, that zones that used to be safe are no longer safe after torrential rains. So doing better risk assessments of which areas of the country are at risk from different type of events and helping housing develop in safer areas would be critical. Also enforcing this, because a lot of these countries have zoning laws and building codes, but are not strictly enforced. So still housing gets built near a river that floods every now and then, or with poor quality materials that are not able to withstand wind. So it's a combination of efforts. It's not only building better, but building in better zones and being better prepared to when this type of disaster strikes.
Very well.
Manuel, I'll just jump in, and I can't really answer the last question, but at least I can refer to it, because I asked myself the same question reading the book. When you say the Caribbean, what Caribbean are you talking about, right? How's it defined? And I think that I'm not sure if you say this explicitly, but essentially the book focuses on the sovereign states of CARICOM. And so Puerto Rico, USVI, Aruba, Curacao, et cetera, weren't part of the context of the study. I very much take your point, and it actually would be interesting to look at how some of the non-sovereign states have weathered some of these challenges versus the sovereign states. As you alluded to, in the case of natural disasters, you could say the non-sovereign states haven't done that well either.
Just to add, for example, in some of the charts that I showed, the Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands are included in terms of the frequency of events and the damages they have. So we did account for some of that. It's just that our focus was, as mentioned, more in soaring CARICOM members.
Thank you. We have a chance for 3 more questions.
Good morning. I'm Ambassador Philip Spencer from Trinidad and Tobago. Let me first say thank you for this morning's panel, and my apologies, I had to attend another event and come now. I'm going to perhaps frame a question quickly in the context of the outlook provided by the U.S. Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act, because I think it provides good framework and context. If we accept that the outlook on peace and stability in the Caribbean generally is good, there are 2 other big agenda that I've always sensed the region needs to address in unleashing its growth and all that. One is the issue of prosperity, and the other is productivity. And I refer to the issue of productivity in particular in my question, because I noticed, in fact, on that graph that human capital, greater human capital, is featured. In fact, for Trinidad and Tobago, I see nothing appearing for us that we have not grown, which is, of course, a reflection and discussion we could have. But how is it that with a high migration rate, with clearly bright people, lots of intellectual capital, the region is not benefiting from that? And the question is it that the opportunities for creating productivity as a driver of growth in the region, those opportunities are not sufficiently integrated into all that happens in the region? And I'm not talking about the productivity of individuals, because those very individuals leave the region and go wherever else and are most productive and so on. What is it in the dynamic in the region that needs to be looked at in terms of creating an environment and a context for productivity? And I highlight productivity finally because we are being encouraged to pursue development by competitiveness. And if you look at all the research that's done on competitiveness, there is no variable in the data, or no variable that speaks to competitiveness. You use proxy variables, principally productivity. Is it that we are not giving enough attention to the whole productivity challenge in the region? Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Selwyn Hart. I'm ambassador of Barbados. And first, let me thank you for such a stimulating discussion. And I agree with the comments, excellent comments from my good friend and colleague from Trinidad and Tobago. I really want to ask the panelists the role of the external environment. Yes, I believe that internally Caribbean countries and Caribbean governments and Caribbean societies need to do a lot more in terms of ensuring that we create an environment where we can have dynamic and competitive economies. But the external environment, I really don't think that we can ignore the external environment, which has not always been supportive of the development aspirations of Caribbean countries. And for example, you made the point about the loss of trade preferences, but I think it's a lot deeper than that. The high per capita incomes of Caribbean countries has resulted in a lack of access to concessional finance at a time when they need to make hard choices in terms of investing in resilience, investing in security, and in a small economy context, government by definition needs to play an oversized role in promoting economic development. So what can the international financial institutions do to lower the cost of capital to Caribbean countries, especially in critical investments like building resilience and security, etc. And in other areas of economic activity, for example, financial services, which I I think it was Dan that raised this as an area of economic diversification. You know, we've had the problem of the absence of a level playing field, unfair targeting by the OECD and other large countries. So the international environment, the point I'm trying to make is that the international environment is a critical factor in supporting the move towards creating competitive and dynamic economies in our region. And my second point refers to the issue of diaspora engagement. I believe, and I've said this since my appointment of ambassador, that we really need to look beyond approaching the diaspora primarily as a source of remittances, right? I believe I see nothing wrong with us targeting members of the diaspora, finding ways of engaging and harnessing the amazing skills, the creativity, the advocacy and promotional power of our diaspora. I believe that Ireland has created a good model.